Welcome to our new series, Envisioning India. I'm James Foster, the co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP as we call it, at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I'm also the moderator of today's conversation with Raghuram Rajan of Chicago's Booth School and Bina Agarwal of Manchester's Global Development Institute on the topic of India's COVID-19 challenge, outcomes, and options. Raghu and Bina, thank you for joining us live from Chicago and New Delhi, here in the heart of Washington, D.C. In just a moment, our own Ajay Chhibber, who as distinguished visiting scholar in IIEP has organized the series, will join us to set the stage and formally introduce our distinguished guests. But first, a word of thanks to our co-sponsor, the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, located right next door in the Elliott School, and its director, Ben Hopkins, who himself is an historian of modern South Asia. Thanks, Ben. I also want to give a shout out to my colleague, Jay Shambo, fresh from his successful term as director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings, who has agreed to co-direct IIEP with me. Jay, it's great having you back full-time in the Elliott School. Say hello.
Thanks very much, James. I'm really thrilled to be here. This looks like a terrific event, and I'll let you get to it.
Thank you, sir. Now, for those of you who haven't attended a previous IIEP event, either in the Elliott School or online, you can expect a nonpartisan, lively, and informative conversation on topics such as U.S. economic relations with China, urbanization and poverty, global economic governance, climate change, green finance, and digital trade. On Monday, we began the fall season of our Facing Inequality series, which featured Nora Lustig and co-author Guido Neidhofer on the distributional impacts of COVID-19 in Latin America. On Friday, October 30th, World Bank Chief Economist Carmen Reinhart will kick off our 13th annual US-China conference with a keynote address, and the first of many episodes in our China conference series. Our Envisioning India series began last month with a terrific presentation on finance in India by Viral Acharya, with insightful comments by Liaquat Ahmed and Rakesh Mohan. Please join us again in November when Rohini Pandey of Yale University comes to GW for the next episode of Envisioning India. If you can't make an event synchronously, videos can be found on our YouTube channel at IIEP GW. Now, over to my colleague Ajay Chhibber for formal introductions. Professor?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, James. So before I introduce our very distinguished speakers, not that they need an introduction, let me just tee up the event. There won't be a formal presentation, so I thought I'd just tee up some numbers on where India stands on COVID today. So India has about 1/5 of the cases in the world, 7.31 million, and about 1/10 of the deaths. So India claims its death rate is lower than the average for the world, but of course it could be that the number of deaths have not been counted properly. We have to blame President Trump for the fact that we are not number 1 in the world, we are number 2 in the world, because the US cases have also been rising. We should have, my prediction to my Thursday lunch club was that India would be number 1 in the world by now, but we have to blame President Trump for the fact that we are still number 2 only, not number 1 in the number of cases in the world. Anyway, the economy is off the cliff. The first quarter of this fiscal year, which in India's case is from April to June 2020, we had negative 25% GDP growth. And for the whole year, the predictions are somewhere between -5 and -10%. Of course, the IMF has just come out with the WEO, the World Economic Outlook, yesterday. And they're projecting India's growth to be more than less than -10%, meaning -10.5. I don't remember the exact decimal point, but it's even worse than -10%. And they also show that Bangladesh's per capita income will now be higher than India's per capita income, if their prediction is right. We have a well-known industrialist, Rajiv Bajaj, who runs Bajaj, famous Bajaj motorcycle, who said, India flattened the wrong curve, flattened the economy instead of flattening COVID. India was in trouble even before the crisis. The Modi government had projected that India would try to reach a GDP of $5 trillion by 2025. But the economy was already slowing down considerably from 7 to 8% growth to 4 to 5% growth. And at that rate, India would not reach 5 trillion till 2030. And I've done some back of the envelope calculations that India will not reach now 5 trillion till 2035. So this has set us back at least 5 more years. Professor Joe Stiglitz, who's probably known to everyone in this audience, spoke recently on India and said, India has become the poster child of what not to do to address COVID. Of course, he's attracted a lot of negative trolls in India, but that's what he said. Basically, a very top-down approach, a very strict lockdown, killed the economy, but then may have helped spread the disease as well, because a lot of migrants then spread out into the countryside, and probably over 100 million people left the cities for the villages and spread the disease all across the country. And I'm sure Bina and Raghu will talk more about this. The government, of course, now has, we have a government that's very famous for its slogans. So they've come up with a new slogan called Atmanirbhar Bharat, which means self-reliant India. They announced a package of close to 10% of GDP, 20 trillion rupees, to address it, but the fiscal component on it was very small. And there's a lot of debate in India about more money being provided, where people are on both sides. Some think that the Indian government cannot afford to spend more money, and others saying it cannot afford not to. And of course, I'm sure Raghu and Bina will talk about this already. Now, India, as I said, was already in trouble before the crisis. Poverty now will rise even more. Inequality in India was already very high. If you look at the inequality adjusted Human Development Index, which James played a big role in putting together, India's HDI inequality is considerably lower than the HDI score itself. So India was already a very unequal country and will become even more unequal in the future. So India is between a rock and a hard place. And let's see how we'd love to hear the two distinguished panelists. I'm not going to read out their CVs because they are so well known, but just to say that I first I first heard of Bina in 1997 from my wife, who's a sociologist, who did a review of her famous book, Field of One's Own, for the ASA journal, the Contemporary Sociology. and said to me, I've just read the best book I've ever read on development. And then she sent a recommendation to the ASA to declare it the best book on development that year. I then first met Bina actually in Delhi when we were launching the Gender Human Development Report. And Bina may or may not recall that was the day a bill was being taken to the Indian Parliament to reserve seats for women in our parliament. And I think it went through one house and didn't go through the other, and I lost track of it by now. But that was the first time I met Bina. And the second time was when she helped, she was at the ceremony and spoke at the ceremony to launch the first independent evaluation office of India. So that's Bina for you. Of course, she has won many, many awards, as you can see from the bio. And she's a brilliant speaker, as you will find out. I don't know if Raghu is still there or not. Yeah, he's there?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, hi, Raghu. So Raghu, of course, also has he's a rock star in India. When he was the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, I think the Hollywood, all the male Hollywood well-known hotshots were extremely scared of his popularity. He was, of course, you see his bio with all his awards. I first met Raghu when he was chief economist at the IMF, and we used to meet sometimes. He's a very good tennis player and a squash player, and we agreed to play at some point, but we've never done that, Raghu. We met again in Delhi when he was chief economic advisor, and I had gone back to India to help set up that office. And then he went on to the Reserve Bank of India, where he did very major reforms. But more importantly, I think began the whole process of, bringing more transparency to the financial system in a very big way. He has written, of course, not just on India, but on global issues, and has, many awards, as you can see. So I'm going to first turn it over to you, Raghu, and then we'll follow by asking Bina to speak after that. So over to you.
Thank you, Ajay. And given this technology, just stop me if at any point I become ununderstandable. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in India on the economic front. And I'm no pandemic expert, so I will leave any discussion of what's happened to others on the panel who are more expert than I am. It's best to think of the pandemic response across the world as containing at least 4 stages, right? The first stage is containment, and while you're addressing the disease, the virus with lockdowns and so on, it's also important to provide relief. Now, relief is a form of support which maintains the structure of the economy from atrophying. Payments to households so that they can sit at home and not go out to work, payments to small and medium enterprises so that they can hold on to labor, and they can manage a period when they have no revenues but significant costs, so that when the economy is back, when the virus has been contained, the economy can spring back in a strong way. Now, obviously, when the pandemic first hit, the sense was containment would be short. People took a lot of hope from the way China had acted, and that the relief measures would have to be very limited, and then economies could come back. And what we've seen, of course, is that relief measures have had to be in place for a much longer time, and we are still to see containment fully successful, certainly in the United States and India, but also in a number of Latin American economies, and now increasingly in Europe. The second part of the economic response is recovery as you pick up. And of course, until people feel confident mingling, there are some parts of the economy which won't come back. High contact services, restaurants, hotels, tourism are going to take longer. And if you do bring them back, you run the risk of that second wave. The third phase is repair and reallocation. There are many firms with heavy debts which will have to be taken care of because otherwise they will be unable to grow given the debt overhang, given their inability to access credit, given the high levels of debt. And also there will be some firms which have to be closed down and their assets reallocated so that they can be used well elsewhere because that business no longer really exists. And finally, there's the reform process, which tries to enhance growth beyond its current potential. And so countries have done different elements of these. Turning to emerging markets like India, Mexico, and Peru, they've been very badly affected by the virus. Again, I'll leave it to others to explain how much this has been mismanagement. But the reality is, in these countries, you can't do much activity sitting at home. Some of my colleagues have shown that in the US, 45% of work can be done from home, while it's 10% in Bangladesh, which, as we've just heard, is a very comparable country to India. So, given that, lockdowns are very, very costly. And of course, households have much thinner buffers in these poorer countries, so the damage done is significantly more. And also, to some extent, the damage is not going to be seen for a long time. Because if you sort of take your kids out of school, you can't put them back because they fall behind. And you can't put them back because they fall behind, and you have to take them out of school permanently. That's a big problem. So what you see in these situations is there's significant damage, but you can't also close down because people need livelihoods. You don't have much of a safety net, and you've been quite ineffective in sending cash to the right households. So you open despite high infections. Now, there is a temptation then to confuse the pent-up demand that comes back for a full-fledged recovery. And there's a lot of talk in India, in some other countries, of V-shaped recoveries. Well, it's V-shaped until it stops being a recovery. It goes up and then it plateaus. And that's what we're seeing in India, plateauing, because there's significant portions of demand which are not coming back for the foreseeable future because the supply, people have lost jobs and cannot express demand. Think of all the people employed by the restaurants, by the hotels, by tourism, who don't have jobs. And so most economies come back to a 75, 80, 90%, depending on how comfortable people feel moving around. But then they plateau there because people still want to maintain social distancing till a vaccine comes about. So what can these countries do? Typically, on the central bank side, many central banks have cut interest rates and expanded their balance sheets. They've basically tried to finance the government. These expanded balance sheets, I think, for the short run, when banks have stopped lending, are a way for the central bank to intermediate between the banks and the government to temporarily finance the expanded deficits. But eventually, because these countries still have moderate inflation, and that inflation can pick up, especially if they have domestic supply constraints, basically the central bank can't do too much of this. Nevertheless, despite the ability of the central banks to expand their balance sheets as they've done in Indonesia, in India, and elsewhere, governments have been very cautious, partly because they see markets as reacting if they spend too much. One exception here has been Brazil, which has augmented the Bolsa Familia program and spent a lot. But India, as Ajay just said, has spent relatively little in direct relief to households, spent a little bit on credit relief to small and medium enterprises, but typically this has gone to the better small and medium enterprises, not to the rest. So what emerging markets are facing is, on the one hand, as much damage to the households and to the SMEs as occur in industrial countries, perhaps more because we haven't still contained the virus, lowered potential growth over the medium term because of this damage, and very little relief because these governments have been very focused on maintaining their credit ratings rather than perhaps spending a little more and trying to reduce the damage. Now, if you're not going to do a lot in relief, then you have to be much more prepared to do repair because there are lots of small and medium enterprises, even large enterprises, which have high debt loads, who have borrowed in order to try and stay open. And for them, these debts can become unsustainable fairly quickly. So fixing the corporate debt structure is going to be extremely important to preserve the productive capacity of the economy. A lot of economists keep thinking about how do we protect aggregate demand in the face of this virus. In many situations, aggregate supply is as much of a problem. Preserving the productive capacity of the economy and ensuring that that productive capacity, the costs of a shrunken supply side doesn't spread to the financial sector and create more problems. So repair is extremely important. And unfortunately, many countries think at this point shutting down the repair process, closing down the bankruptcy code, closing down restructuring, forbearance is really the way to go because this will give time. But usually time is not the great healer with bad debts. In fact, it increases bad debts and creates much bigger problems down the line as these companies are unable to produce and become effective zombies. So for many emerging markets, the key issue going forward is how to deal with the distress that is plaguing their corporate sector. If that distress morphs into financial sector distress, it augments the problem significantly more. And if that augments into national distress or sovereign debt distress, obviously the problems are significantly greater. So for emerging markets, this is a big problem. For developing countries, often sovereign distress is already there. Zambia, we know, is trying to restructure its debts. Venezuela, Argentina are way in debt and have problems. So across the emerging and developing world, distress is going to be an issue going forward. Now, the one saving grace in all this is really the external sector. Certainly in India, is not a huge problem. Many emerging markets, it is. But in India, it's not. India has 500 billion plus in reserves. We still see money coming in. So the fear of not meeting your external obligations is really limited, especially given that India is probably going to run a current account surplus this year because imports have been damaged much more than exports. So what is holding back the government in perhaps spending a little more, but also accompanying that spending with much more commitment to come back to the fiscal path of the medium term? It seems like to avert the damage, you really, in India, should be working on helping poorer households, on helping small and medium corporations. And I believe to some extent, it may be a prioritization which is misguided or has become politicized, that because the opposition has been pushing for this kind of help, to now give in and do it may be a reflection of the fact that the government priorities were wrong in the past. But also, I think the government is much more worried about a decline in credit rating in the short term, even though if it doesn't help repair the damage to the underlying economy, that credit rating change will happen in the longer term. So we should not be focused on the credit rating agencies for their stamp of approval. We need to do what is right, and the credit rating agencies will come around. And for that, at this point, I am in the camp that believes the government has to do far more on support to the households and the corporations, especially because the virus is tending to be more long drawn than we think. And second, in terms of repairing the balance sheets of the households. Let me end by just saying, what do we need to do to get growth going? Clearly, containing the virus is important. I've already talked about cash relief to the poorest households. And we need to open up the key areas of the economy because keeping them shut is not viable. here we need to prioritize. We should prioritize schools over opening up cinema houses because certainly the minds of our children are really important. I've talked about repairing the corporate and financial sector. Longer term, that is, by the end of the year, we should be stimulating the economy through more spending on infrastructure. And if we need resources, we should be selling our holdings in public sector companies. We should be doing those asset sales even now when the stock market is doing well. We also need fiscal commitments over the medium term, ensure that we make transparent our fiscal process, and ensure that we bring our debt and our fiscal deficits under control over the medium term. There are legislative means to do that. Last point, we've done some reforms. There's been a lot of hullabaloo in India about whether those reforms were done with the appropriate consent of the opposition. I think it's appropriate to take all parties on board, but the central reforms we really need are primarily on land mapping and acquisition, because that's standing in the way of infrastructure spending, which will be important for recovery, and reforms on the external sector. India's been too quick on raising tariffs, and the external sector, as again Arvind Subramaniam has been showing, is extremely important for our growth. Bottom line, don't do harm. We need steady, positive actions. And essentially, I think if we can do that, India has some hope of turning around. Happy to talk about it in the discussion. But over to you, back to you, Ajay.
Go ahead, Ajay, if you want to take it over.
No, it's let's go to Bina first, and then we come.
Yes, so before we go to Bina, I just want to remind everyone to start formulating your questions. We have a Q&A platform here. Use it as we go on. Great, thank you. Bina.
So firstly, I warmly want to thank Ajay Chhibber for inviting me to speak today. And also thank you, James, as the co-host. Both of you have been I've been hearing some of the seminars, and it's wonderful you've launched this series. It's also a great privilege to share this panel with Dr. Raghuram Rajan. He has been a Dr. Fauci on the health of the Indian economy in providing key corrections to official views. So what I will do now is actually focus on agriculture and the rural economy. And to set the stage, I thought I would play a clip from an interview I gave to Brad Paris on 9th April to remind us of what it was like 6 months ago. Something like 90% of India's workforce is in the informal economy, which includes agriculture, the rural sector, but also the urban informal sector. At the moment, most of them are really without jobs. Center for Monitoring Indian Economy put out some figures on the basis of a sample survey, which was that unemployment was as high as 23.8%. Large numbers of people have gone back. They have no incomes, and much will depend on the efficiency and the commitment with which state governments are able to deliver the packages, both of cash and of kind, to all households. So if you really think about it, it's really all the way along the value chain. Rabi harvest is due, and this relates to both basic staples, wheat and rice in particular, and pulses, but also it relates to fruits and vegetables, which are perishable. One of the things that's happened with the lockdown is that there is great shortage of labor, farm labor, to be able to harvest these in time. How do you take this to the market? You have to store them. You need gunny bags. The states which provide gunny bags are not the same states which are producing the surplus. So how do truckers, where most of the trucks are not operating, move those gunny bags to farmers which want to store this? Then how do you load them? Because you need labor to load these onto trucks. Then you have to take it to the market. And then you need people to be able to come to the markets. and they need cash to be able to buy from the markets. If you then rev up the figures and say, let's have 5,000 rupees per family, let's say a family of 5 or 6, and then you calculate by number of months, then it will be certainly much higher than that in terms of the proportion of GDP. The question which, if you're only looking at this in economic terms, would say, well, how do you deal with the deficit, financial deficit? Because our revenue is also going down in terms of indirect taxes. If you're not selling things, you're not getting those taxes. But I think right now what's important is people's livelihoods and lives.
So, when that was 6 months ago, and when I did that interview, we were harvesting the Rabi crop. And I just want to make sure that are we all back, Ajay?
Yes, we're here. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So, so we were harvesting the Rabi crop, and we are now sowing Rabi. And Kharif has been quite bountiful. We something like 144 million tons of food grains, which is much more than last year. So perhaps it's not surprising then in the first quarter of this financial year, when the overall GDP contracted by 23.9%, it was really the peak. Agriculture grew by 3.4%. So the question is, can agriculture make up for degrowth elsewhere? And can we do better than this plodding long-term 3% growth rate? And I'll try and provide some answers. My answers are that agriculture, along with the rural economy, could certainly lead us forward. But the extent to which it can do so will depend not only on fixing its ills, but transforming it. And for this, we need to take a longer-term view than quarterly reviews of the economy. So where are we in agriculture? Despite its green shoots, agriculture is ailing, I believe. It contributes only 15 to 16% of the GDP. And even 70 years of planning, we only have 44% of our irrigable area as irrigated. We are rapidly losing our groundwater. Our soils are degraded. Our extension services are barely functional. And we have serious problems of climate change. So let's take water, which is really the key to higher production and yields. Now, India uses 90% of its groundwater for irrigation, and it has been grossly over-extracting. I mean, just think of Punjab, a surplus state. Water tables have been falling by about 2.3 feet per year since 2000. So many aquifers have hit arsenic level, and by recent World Bank estimates across India, 65% of our blocks will be over-extracting by 2030. And much of this depletion has been due to government policy, especially free electricity. So, for instance, in the Punjab again, between 1997 and 2002, this led to a 40% decline in canal irrigation and a rise in groundwater use. And no state has metered groundwater except West Bengal. 37% of our geo area the soil is degraded. And I think the most important thing is that our farms are really small. 86% of our farms are 2 hectares or less. 70% cultivate less than 1 hectare or about a hectare. And most of these are too small to effectively even use machinery. 75 to 80% borrow credit informally, barely 6 to 12% sell in mandis or at the minimum support price. I mean, these figures really matter when we're talking about the current debates. And if we add to this climate change, the sharpest fall in crop yields among countries is likely to be in India. So perhaps it's not surprising that many farmers say they would prefer another job. There's an All India survey which asked 50,000 farmers, do you like farming? And 40% said they did not. So to these unhappy farmers, we have now added millions of migrant returnees. So agriculture as it stands cannot hold up the economy sustainably. Farm incomes are low, they're erratic, and they cannot provide the demand stimulus that we need. And then we add these figures of extreme poverty numbers. The latest figures, as we all know, predict that we'll add about 88 million globally in 2020 alone, and a large part of this will be in India. So we are having what I see as developmental reversals. The question is, can agriculture do better? And I believe it can, but we need to be transformative in terms of our change. I believe we are too fixated on output prices and markets, but our 86% of smallholders can only gain if they first produce enough surplus. At present, 70% farmers produce less than 4 to 5% of marketed surplus of the main grains like wheat and rice. And this is in the surplus producing states. So what do we have to do? I think we have to change the way we farm. We need to treat the farm's allies, fisheries and forests, with more respect. And we must partner with the wider rural economy, which along with agriculture provides 46% of our GDP. So let's just, in short, just go through these in turn. How do we change the way we farm? And there are many challenges. So I think the first challenge, as I see it, is irrigation and water conservation. We need to expand irrigated area, but also not by groundwater mining. Really what we need is a complex mesh of groundwater regulation, rainwater harvesting, and micro-irrigation. Because rainwater catchments provide both surface irrigation, but they also recharge groundwater. And we must remember that India has a very ancient history of rainwater harvesting. We have stunning architecturally designed step wells in Rajasthan and many other states. But even in modern times, we've done this successfully. So I'll give you an example. Between 1999 and 2009, Gujarat's agriculture grew at almost 10%. And it's attributable particularly to rainwater harvesting and BT cotton. And over some 10 to 15 years, Gujarat built 0.5 million microstructures. These are check dams, bunds, and so on. Many of you will remember Anna Hazare. His village, Ralegaon Siddhi in Maharashtra, which I had visited, harvested so much rainwater that it was enough even for neighboring villages. Also, we need micro irrigation. This is very important for efficient irrigation, drip irrigation, sprinkler. Now, there was a 2014 government study of 13 states which found that micro irrigation, especially drip, could significantly not only reduce water and fertilizer use, but it actually raised yields, wheat yields by 25%, vegetable yields by 52%. But then guess what? Only 6 to 7% of India's crop area is under micro irrigation. Now, Narega is actually a very good opportunity to build check dams, tanks, and so on, but we do need hydrological inputs. And of course, we need less water guzzling crops. The second challenge is shifting from cereal monoculture to multi-crops. There's a great deal of talk globally now on agroecological farming. This would save costs, it would employ more labor, and it would increase net incomes and profits. So if we really want to move to high value produce, poultry, fruits, vegetables, which would be in keeping with our dietary patterns, then I think much more mixed farming is really where we need to go. And I was looking to see, is there any evidence on how productive this would be? And I saw a recent survey of 57 countries, which covered 286 projects with diverse experiments in sustainable farming. And they found a mean yield increase of 79%. So it can be done. The third challenge is, of course, research in heat-resistant crops and efficient extension. And again, it's, there's an opportunity here because there's a recent article in Science which found that providing agricultural information via cell phones increased yields by 4%. And the odds of adopting recommended inputs by 22% across a range of countries, including India. And fourthly, and this has been, I've been talking about this for quite a long time, the most difficult and essential challenge is institutional change. I believe we need cooperation in production and not just in marketing. So if we say our farms are too small, they're too small for economies of scale or providing farmers enough bargaining power in diverse markets, what we need, therefore, is cooperation in production. Now, cooperation can be at various levels, but I've been writing and thinking a lot of what I term fully integrated cooperation, which would mean pooling land, labor, capital to farm collectively in small groups. But unlike the 1960s, when we misguidedly tried to bring together large and small farmers, the new approach would be based on adapting the self-help group model. And we already have a huge success story. For instance, in Kerala, in the early 2000s, Kerala was part of its Kudum Shri anti-poverty mission, and it promoted all women group enterprises, especially group farming. So under this, 4 to 10 women come together to jointly cultivate leased in land. They pool their labor and resources, they share costs and returns. And today, there are 68,000 such farms, not 1 or 2, not 10 or 15, 68,000. So I did some detailed research where I compared a sample of group and individual farms in 2 districts of Kerala. And I found that the groups had 1.8 times the annual value of output per hectare and 5 times the net return per farm relative to individual family farms, 95% of which were male managed. And also the net return per farm of the groups was rupees 1.2 lakhs, which was 3 times the all India average of 37,000 per farm in the same year. Now, groups, interestingly, can also better deliver on contracts, on niche bananas, for instance, the women could deliver. But what's, I think, most importantly, that 50,000 groups were cultivating in the COVID season, and 87% of them survived economically. These are Kudum Shri's figures. And these are especially vegetable farmers. So where you had individual vegetable farmers lose most of their produce because they couldn't harvest, they didn't have the labor or didn't have market access. These women's groups were able to do that. We also have examples of group farming in Telangana, in Tamil Nadu, now in East India and Gujarat. And just to remind ourselves, we have 6 million self-help groups. Many of them are running group enterprises, but many more could do so, including group farming, agro-processing, and so on. The 5th challenge, of course, is land access, especially Raghu mentioned this, and I hope to come back to this, but especially via leasing in the case of agriculture, because leasing is either banned or seriously restricted in most states. So I have some ideas on how we might reform it, not in the way the government has been thinking about it, but we can talk about it later. So all these are pointers of ways of transforming crop production. But then let's not forget livestock, and especially fisheries and forests. Livestock contributes 20% of the gross value added from for milk production and so on, 20% of the total. And it's poor-centric and it's women-centric. And of course, we know about cooperative marketing of milk by Amul. But less talked about are 2 sectors, fisheries and forests. And I just want to mention these, that 25% of the world's animal protein comes from fish. Over half the fish consumed come from aquaculture, which is inland fisheries. And India is the world's 2nd largest producer of aquaculture fish. And fisheries today employ 13.5 million people, and 32% are women. Now, in 2017-18, fisheries grew at 11.9%. And if you take the average of several years, it was about 7%. So again, there's a huge potential for growth here, and especially for women's groups. The 3rd friend of farmers are forests. Now, we tend to forget these, but globally, 1 in 6 rural persons, especially women, depend on forests and commons for food, for various other needs. And the economics of ecosystem services and biodiversity, they estimated that forests and commons provide 47% of India's GDP of the poor. They term this phrase GDP of the poor. Much of this I don't think gets counted in our GDP. But then we need to protect our forests and revive our forests. And here again, we did something, we had a transformative shift in 1990 when we launched community forestry. And today we see the fruits of that because our forest cover has been slowly increasing. Today it's about 21.5% of our geo area. We have a target of 33%. And here protection, plantation, biodiversity restoration, again, has great possibilities for thousands of jobs. So basically, I'm saying that if you want to transform agriculture ecologically, technically, and institutionally, we should treat crops, livestock, fish, and forest as an integrated whole. And again, I believe that this transformation will need cooperation among smallholders and rural communities. And then finally, I want to say that a major partner of farmers is, of course, the rural sector, because we often tend to forget that as much as 61% of the income of rural households comes from the non-farm sector. So what can we do to enlarge farm and non-farm linkages? Now, we know that the sector is very heterogeneous. It, from food to garments to textiles to construction, transport, and services. And there are people who are salaried, those who are casual workers, they are self-employed. But I think there is potential in at least 4 areas. One is agro-processing. Now this, I'll give you this figure which surprised me when I came across it, that 80% of food consumed by rural households is purchased, and it's largely from SMEs. So there's potential, great potential there. Then machine tools. Now we know, if you think of Ludhiana in the 80s and 1990s, it is one of our biggest rural hub of machine tools and machinery. And it emerged via links with the fast growing agriculture in the 80s. So there's Tamil Nadu, we need much more of this. The third is, I think we do have ecotourism, we can expand on that, but there is a possibility of farm tourism. And then there is, of course, health and education services, which many people have been talking about, and I just want to underline it and not belabor it. So what would this mean for economic revival? I think increase in the incomes of rural households would boost demand. Now, there were some expenditure elasticities which are reported by Metrish Ghatak recently. And what they used was CMI data, which suggests that a rise in incomes of the bottom 50% of rural households would help increase especially there would be a demand for high value food, education, health, and communications. The communications is actually, if you look behind it, if you ask people what they want, some of the surveys say, well, they want a mobile phone. So people do want to connect, it's just that they can't afford it. So let me conclude, because this series was called Envision India, and so I envision in India, if you look a few years ahead, is one that builds back the economic and social fabric of rural communities. And with technical and institutional transformation, I think it can also help retain many of our rural youth in their places of origin, rather than have them tread hundreds of miles and live among strangers. So let me end with that. Thank you.
Fantastic, Bina. Raghu and Bina, you've painted a lovely picture of what is out there currently in India, the challenges ahead. I'm going to turn it over to the first question from Chhibberji.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that, Raghu and Bina. Wonderful. There is a general, theme that emerges from your talk, which is that not only does India have to find a way to get through this crisis situation that it is in at the moment, but that things were not going so well even before, and that this may be also an opportunity for a reset. I would call it a reset for the 21st century for India, because we've come through almost 70 some years now. It's all going to be 75 soon of our independent history, but now we were kind of in a rut, so to speak, and now we have to reset, and this may be an opportunity to reset for the future. So with that in mind, if I could go back to both of you with a couple of pointed questions. I really like the way, Raghu, you set up this issue of, the way you called it was, let's see here, how do you say, relief, repair, restore, and recovery. I really like the way you did that as well. But let me ask you a little bit on some of the reforms which you started. Actually, I give you credit for starting the process of cleaning up the financial sector. I don't think any Reserve Bank governor before you had brought it out as clearly as you had. But now I just saw the RBI's latest financial stability report where the NPAs projected, NPAs in the state banks are going to go up to 14% and maybe even higher if a worse scenario emerges. So without that, and we started a cleanup process, but it was, to my mind, very slow. So how do you see that? I mean, if you get that kind of a situation post-COVID, we find a cure, find a vaccine, but you still have that. And then how shouldn't there be a more aggressive process of cleanup? Because without a cleaned up financial system, and what would that entail in your mind? How practical would it be? And also, you know, one of the big thing on this cooperative fiscal situation of cooperative federalism was the GST. And now it's in a complete shambles. The compact between the states and the center is breaking down. And how do you see that? So those are two questions for you, Raghu. And also for Bina, I would say, you know, this link between climate, agriculture, land use, water that you brought out. You know, the opportunity for a brief period, you know, the air in India cleaned up and more lives might have been saved there than perished from COVID. But I don't know, I don't know the exact numbers, but you know, that nexus of things. But agriculture has not been reformed. Agriculture has been heavily intervened by the government into free electricity, MSPs, people producing rice in Punjab and Haryana, and sugarcane and all these things in Maharashtra. So this may be an opportunity for a major reform in the agriculture sector that will reset, as I said, for the 21st century. So back to both of you for.
Okay. So first, thanks, Bina, for that wonderful exposition. I mean, it seems to me that there are so many things that could be done. One of the beauties about India is how many low-hanging fruit we have that can be plugged to restore growth. So it's never a good thing to lose hope because there's lots of opportunities. At the same time, I think one has to recognize that a lot has gone wrong. I mean, you talked about cleanup, right? Cleanup in many countries has to be a short process. Now, it is necessary because even one of the things I keep talking about is how public sector banks had stopped lending in India right from 2014 because of the accumulation of bad debts on their balance sheets. And they were just worried, if I make a new loan, it's going to go bad. And in fact, you know, the worst amongst them were continuing to make loans because they didn't realize how bad loans they were making. And so they had to be put under what is called prompt corrective action, which essentially didn't allow them to make any more loans. Effectively, these were fiscal transfers to the richest people in India, the entrepreneurs. Actually, it wasn't even to them because many of them were hurting because the reason their projects were stuck was because the government was stuck and wasn't moving ahead. So it was a mess. And it was important that it be cleaned up. Why? Because if you have an entrepreneur who has a huge amount of debt that he or she has little hope of paying, basically they coast. They say, well, if a miracle happens, this project works, and then I can pay down my debt. But I'm not going to put any more money into it, and I'm not going to put any effort into it because none of my money is at stake. It's already been wiped out. So these decapitalized projects essentially go nowhere, but they act as an overhang on the system because there are resources which are embedded there. Now, you may have seen, for example, when you travel in Mumbai, a lot of high-rise buildings have been incomplete for many years. You know, they're sitting there. You think how much concrete is stuck here, and there are no homes for people because it's uninhabitable. It hasn't been completed. That's again an entrepreneur who's for some reason got stuck, has no incentive to put in any more money, and the project doesn't get finished. And so you need to clean up in order to get resources back on track. You need to clean up to get firms starting to produce again. You need to clean up for the banks to realize how bad mistakes they've made in the past and how they need to reconfigure their process of on lending. But who has the incentive to do this? Nobody. The government wants to push it into the futures, maybe into some other government's hands. Why do it now? It's a pain. The entrepreneurs have no incentive to see a reckoning at this point because they might lose the company. And of course, the bankers fear recognizing losses because then the CBI and the CVC and the CAG, all the investigative agencies, will come after them. So that's what we need to fix. We need to do it fast. We need to clean up so we can get back on track. Otherwise, we'll have decades of lost growth. And this is not a minor problem. After the pandemic, it has become even bigger. Think of if we hadn't cleaned up a little bit before the pandemic, how much bigger the bad loan problem would be during the pandemic. At least we now know a little bit of how to do it, but it is still very serious. And that leads to another issue, which I think you were hinting at. Everything is really centralized in India, right up to the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister himself. Nothing moves until they say, yes, you can do it. In the meantime, the processes don't move forward very much. And cleanup is, for example, something which needs actions every day. Okay, we need to do this. We can revoke that. We need to move forward on this. It's a constant process of working with the people doing the cleaning up so that you remove the impediments and it goes forward, right? And if you're not on the job every day, pushing it forward, it will clog up, it will stop. Because as I said, very few people have the incentive to do it. The incentive and the thrust has to come from the very top. But it also has to be decentralized. Once you say, yes, do it, you need to appoint somebody there who is going to take charge. And that person cannot be in the Prime Minister's office. So what I sense is a certain amount of frustration in the center that this doesn't work as it worked in the state government. It sort of is much harder to run the central government this way, which then leads to these jhatkas. Instead of here's the broad overview of how things should be, how things sort of fit together, it's sort of constant announcement of one big policy, which is supposed to change everything. But with the details not worked out, often it does more harm. We saw what happened with demonetization when, I don't even think there was a chance it could work out in the desired way, but it obviously set back small and medium enterprises quite a bit. GST was a policy that has been advocated for a long time, but in the details, as well as in the rollout, it turned out to be a problem. We've talked about the lockdown and how it happened suddenly and in a big way. Again, didn't have the advertised effect. Take even Atmanirbhar Bharat, this idea of self-reliance. If self-reliance is let's create the environment for production, great. If self-reliance is about increasing tariffs, I mean, it's going to create a lot of confusion. If I put my factory in India, are they suddenly going to increase tariffs on my inputs? So I can't actually produce as advertised just because there's some other sort of competitor who pushes the authorities. We've moved from the center giving a big picture architecture, this is where we're going, to specific policies, and that to specific policies which are not carried through in their entirety. And so I would argue we need to rethink this way of working because, you just pointed out, Bangladesh is now overtaken India. Hopefully this is a wake-up call that our policies over the last 5 years before the pandemic have been deeply problematic. We need to think about what the new sort of vision for India is, and it has to be decentralized, the policy making. This is last point, cooperative federalism. We've talked the talk, but never walked the walk. And it's not just the center vis-a-vis the states, it's the states vis-a-vis the municipalities, vis-a-vis the panchayats, etc. We've always talked about decentralization, but we always want to hold, the powers in our hands. We're not willing to relinquish the powers. If we relinquish the powers, we don't relinquish the funding. And if India is really to work, it's too big a country to be run from the center, too big a country to even be run from the state capital. It has to be much more decentralized. But for that, you need a good vision of what the overall architecture is. What do I want to do? Do I want to be a more open economy, be more focused on exports, or shut down? I mean, that is the level at which the center can give its thoughts, but then the details have to be worked out much lower.
I mean, we have the language of economists, But we also need another language to talk about the same things. So if we are envisioning India, we need to have a much more integrated approach. So let's take land, because Raghu, if I may call you Raghu, mentioned land acquisition. Now, the way somebody sitting in Delhi may talk about land acquisition would be very different from the way farmers would see land acquisition, and you end up with a lot of conflict. So you take this famous Land Acquisition Act, in which they said, let's have land pooling. And so the idea is, okay, farmers will voluntarily come together, and you will have you want a large chunk of land for industry to take over. You'll develop that. You give 60% back to the farmers, 40% you keep. And what will the farmers get? Well, they'll get some land somewhere else at higher value. So here are my questions to that approach. My questions are, does anybody have rights to that land? Do they have, you have a household, today it's a joint family property, men, women, children, all have rights to that. Will they have the same rights when you reestablish claims elsewhere? Who will get the compensation within those? Or are you just going to give it to the head of the household and the rest of the people will be destituted? Those questions, those real questions are really not asked, because we talk about policy in a much more macro way. And we need to have a dialogue about that among ourselves, who all want a different India. On the land question on reform, I did want to say this. I didn't use up my earlier intervention for that. Now, we know that in India, tenancy, agricultural land, in fact, you can, several states ban the leasing of agricultural land, and many other states seriously restrict it. Now, we know in reality that agricultural land has been leased informally ever since the 50s and 60s. It's always happened, but it's informal. It doesn't, the landlord doesn't want to give it to the tenant because there are rights embedded in the land reform laws, which are then put into the 9th schedule of the Indian Constitution. So how Planning Commission has been talking about this for at least 3 decades. What do we do about this? So the Niti Aayog has come up with the Model Tenancy Act. And I looked at that act, and basically it says, okay, let's have a formal contract between the tenant and the farmer. I'm condensing it, usually it's several pages long. And there'll be, it'll be for a certain period of time. The tenant doesn't establish rights over the land and will return it at the end of the contract if it's not renewed. And if there is a conflict, then the panchayat will intermediate. Now, what it misses out is that the reason why you haven't had formal lease contracts is precisely because there's lack of trust. So here's an alternative idea. So I'm going to put it out here, which I had shared, which is there in the 12th five-year plan, when I was heading the 12th five-year plan working group on disadvantaged farmers. It's also there in the Times of India when we published it. But so the idea is that how about in the panchayat, you actually set up an office where everybody who wants to lease out their land deposits it, and says, okay, I want to lease so many hectares. And those who want to lease in come in and say, well, I want so much land. So that the intermediary, there's no direct contract. And the bank, so-called community land bank, acts as an intermediary. It acts as a broker. And it bypasses the idea of the tenant having established rights over the land. Now, at one level, it's a simple idea. After all, if you want an apartment in New York, you're not going to knock on every door and say, do you have an apartment on lease? You'll go to an agent. Why is it that in India, in rural areas, the farmer has to go to 3 different people to get small plots of land in 3 parts of the village? Because there is no single person to whom you can go who would have the land records on his computer or her computer and then say, okay, this is available. So why are ideas not picked up, these kinds of ideas? And it goes back to something that Raghu said, which is that things are centralized. So at one point in time, we had planned documents which are created, and there was a lot of inputs from intellectuals and civil society people. And occasionally, some of those recommendations were actually followed through, but you had a degree of meeting ground between the policymakers and those who are going to implement it. We don't have that. So I fully agree that we need decentralization, we need cooperation, but we need more than federal cooperation between states and center. We need cooperation at every level, down to the, you need institutions which cooperate from people who simply understand the village. They don't understand much about corporate, the general idea of federal cooperation, and they understand what's happening around them. But the idea itself is very important. And I think, therefore, Ajay, it's not just reset, it's also pause. We're just running in the wrong direction. We need to pause, rethink, reevaluate, and then move forward.
Thank you both for your comments. Is there anything that Raghu wants to respond with, or should we go on to a question in general? I'm happy to move forward. Right.
No, but I mean,
Yes,
I agree, and I agree entirely with Bina's points, and I think land acquisition has to be thought through carefully, recognizing the need for fairness, but all these issues. I mean, we know that easing of land sales in the United Kingdom in the Middle Ages did a lot of damage to the community. So we need to think about what effects it will have. At the same time, we have to also recognize there is limited bureaucratic capacity. So we can't create a bureaucratic monster. And also we development needs land. Now, how do we marry the interests of all these groups? That's really what we need to do. And I agree entirely with Bina. We need to find innovative solutions, practical solutions, try them out, not just conceptualize them, try them out and roll out in much greater detail once we know that it works.
Fantastic. So then I'll go to our audience. Vinitra Sudhakar, any of Modi's policies seem to disproportionately affect the poor, most notably demonetization and now the pandemic policies. Is there a possibility that the Modi government will readjust their pandemic response to help the poor in India, or do they see the poor as dispensable? Now, I'll put a context there. Of course, the recent results on the multidimensional poverty index has shown a great decrease in poverty in India as a whole. So there's been a combined effort of previous government, this government, making actually a huge impact on poverty, even multidimensionally configured. Nonetheless, there is a perception and perhaps actuality that poor in India are being disproportionately affected by current events and previous policies. So could either of you or both comment on this question?
Let me defer to Bina first, and I'm happy to come in after that.
It's a bit of a rhetorical question, what the Modi government will or will not do, what its intentions are. But I actually would like to hear a little more from you, James, on, you're saying there is a decline in multidimensional poverty, but do you see this would be data from pre-COVID? Would it not?
So yes, all pre-COVID. As of
right.
a year ago, the data for a couple of years back. Yep.
So now, if you look at something like education, for instance, when you've gone digital, there's a huge digital divide between the poor children of the poor and the children of the well-off, and all of that. So what is so you would expect that to be affected. There's questions of health, access to healthcare. Quite apart from people, we know COVID has moved rural. I mean, it's astonishing how similar it is in some ways to the 1914 influenza, because it moved in the second wave entirely to the rural areas, and India was one of those countries where the mortality rate for women within certain age groups was much higher than for men. So now in the rural area, so I would expect to see an increase in poverty in that sense. We will have, so here's the thing, when we look at figures and we say in April 9th, when I did that interview, it was 23.8% unemployment. And today, if you look at the figures, the most recent figures, it's in rural India, it's something like 6%, and 8% in urban. And we say, hurrah, this is really, this is good. But what we tend to forget is the people who are unemployed on April 9th, 2020, what would they have done all these months? They would have reduced their savings. Some may have sold off some of the assets. Yes, some of that is reduced because there has been a transfer of cash and food on many schemes, not fully delivered, but yes, there's Narega. People have found some degree of work. Still, there are huge numbers of people unemployed. But the transition from very high unemployment to somewhat less unemployment, how have people coped and survived? And I don't think that's a very good story. What I was shocked to find just a few days ago was the talk of children being sold. There's child trafficking. Now, this is something we saw in the 1943-44 Great Bengal famine, was that families split up and children were sold off because families could afford to feed them and they could. So I'm just saying that let's see what's happening below these figures.
Yes, indeed. I agree with you on all of this, Bina. The comment I was making was in the lead up to this time, that there certainly has been something that's led us to a better starting point. The final point, of course, is being evaluated right now in OFI, the institute at Oxford that I'm affiliated with. Sabina Alkire and all the group there are trying to understand how multidimensional deprivations are being impacted right now across the world. And it's a tough, you have to get into the data pretty heavily, and it requires a lot of assumptions. But I would assume that you're going to see a tremendous increase in poverty in the short run, for sure. Not to confuse you about that. I apologize for not making that clear. Raghu.
Yeah, look, I would not say that the Modi government is deliberately anti-poor. In fact, if you look at its policies, they've been largely focused on distribution rather than, and that's where they've had their most success, whether it is, rolling out the subsidized gas and so on, or the toilets. Again, the effectiveness of that we have to determine over time, but certainly those programs have been focused on the lower middle class, if not the poor. And where I think the problem sort of arises is probably two ways, and both have a common link. One is that the effects of the policies have not been fully thought through. Demonetization, the impact on the average household, the fact that a lot of housewives used to save in cash, pick up from, put money aside, and didn't have a way to account for it. And a number of households were therefore impacted. We didn't think through that. Similarly, with the lockdown, we didn't think about the effect on migrants and what would support them. And of course, 4 hours was very little notice to give the average household to prepare for what turned out to be a fairly long lockdown. So I think that goes back to the original sort of sin of excessive centralization, where these things are dreamt of in small rooms. For a government which prides itself on being very Indian, it is amazing to me that you haven't thought through all these details, knowing that India doesn't work the same way as everywhere else. And so that to me, taking advice, obviously nobody really knows the entirety of India, but taking advice from wide variety of sources and formulating policy in a much more deliberate fashion might in fact account for all these problems. And lastly, to the point of are the households, okay? Some government officials, for example, have pointed to the rise in amounts in the Jan Dhan account Of course, those could be precautionary savings. Equally, you could point to the rise in gold loans, the point that Bina was making, asset sales taking place, people trying to borrow against their gold because they desperately need to consume. The reality again is we don't quite know what what's going on there, but anecdotal stories seem to suggest that there is a huge amount of distress that needs to be dealt with.
Thank you. I'll go back again to the audience for a question. It's a bit more general in a sense and a little more specific as well. What is your view? What are your views on recent changes made under the Farm Bill? Will it be helpful in increasing the income of the small, marginal farmers? I guess we'll go to Bina on that first.
So let's take the three bills there. I'll just call them the APMC bill. There's the Essential Commodities Bill and the Contract Bill. So the APMC bill is the one that's produced the most agitation, and so let's talk about that. Now, what are these agricultural produce marketing committees or really mandis? Was set up in the in the 60s, 50s, 60s, or subsequently, basically to regulate agricultural produce to the benefit of the farmer. So instead of just selling to the money lender at very low rates with whom you're indebted, there were the credit and other linkages that there's a huge amount of literature on economic literature on that, and to have a much more to allow to aggregate services. So you have these mandis where you could have at its best would have infrastructure, it would have storage yards, it would have traders who were licensed and therefore they could be they could be monitored, and you would have these commission agents who also got a license who would set up shop, and so it in a way it would greatly reduce the transaction costs for farmers because states would be divided geographically and mandis would be within fair amount of reach. The idea was something like a radius of 80 square kilometers. Now, if we actually look at what's happened is it's done well. These mandis have done well for farmers in some areas and not in others. So states like Punjab and Haryana, where you have very large surpluses, they've invested hugely in infrastructure. They charge commission fee, they charge fees, license fees, but then the state reinvests back. They've even got cold storage there. And on the other hand, you have places like Bihar, which has abolished APMC many years ago. And the idea that if you abolish them, private sector will establish infrastructure, it hasn't come to pass at all. So I think if you're talking about small farmers in any case don't have a large amount of surplus. As I'd said, they barely account for, when I said 70%, I was looking at the 1 hectare and less farmers who sell 4 to 5% only or produce of the marketed surplus is from them. And so we have to, instead of just fixing prices and saying, are we going to increase farmers' incomes by having higher prices? And if you abolish the mandis, they'll be able to transact and private sector will be able to give them high prices. I don't think that's going to happen. You have to fix first the fact that they don't have surpluses, the production problem and the structural issues. And then if they have high prices, they would be able to also operate in the mandis. So I would say that mandis where you have cartels and which are not working need reform. But that doesn't mean you completely throw out mandis. And where they're not working, you try and find alternatives. So I think we need not single point solutions for marketing. You need multi-point solutions for marketing. And we need to have a discussion around that. I mean, Haryana, for instance, I remember I visited it some years ago to ask, well, why are the retail chains, how well are they working? And you find that they have a lot of, weekly markets. So people prefer to just go and buy their vegetables in weekly markets. Those could work well. There are weekly markets all over Europe and the UK and so on as well. So the point is, we tend to have this so-called reform with single point solutions, and we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It doesn't solve the problems. I don't think it's really the minimum support price issue, although the farmers have taken it up. I think it's a much more complex issue of where the small farmer will go if you're going to abolish the mandis. If he or she begins to produce a surplus, that needs to be sold not just at the farm gate, where many farmers sell it. But let me also mention that the commission agents in the mandis provide you credit, they provide you information, and you come up with a competitive price. So let's fix the things that are wrong rather than simply abolish them. I mean, of course, it's too late now. You already have the ordinances and the acts.
Raghu? Thank you, Bina.
I can't add much to that. Bina is obviously the expert. I'll just make a parallel observation that this fits with the, trying to have these big picture changes, which don't reflect the fact that the reality on the ground has many layers. And what would be important is to build on what there is and to improve it rather than to try and subvert the whole thing. Another example is small and medium enterprise lending, which, this government has done a lot to expand, but not so much by creating better environment for the small and medium enterprises to flourish, to make more profits and thereby get more credit, not by increasing the information that is available about SMEs, not by increasing collateral registries and so on, but by directly saying thou shalt lend to the public sector banks. And essentially the Mudra scheme was put in place. Enormous amounts of credit have gone to these small and medium enterprises, but their business has been made more difficult through a series of hits to them. And even if it were not for that, it's not clear that they would have been as creditworthy. The point now is that we now have a problem of excessive credit having gone to these small and medium enterprises, which is contributing to the bad loan problem. So, it would have been better to fix it in the small rather than to believe this is all vested interests and therefore the banks weren't lending. So we shall make them lend and then see what you've done. You've created a new problem.
So one final question then from, looks like Selvaraj V. Sir, you suggested that the economy needs to be opened up. Given the fear of COVID looming large, opening up with restricted movement of railway network appears to be a very difficult task. In general, how do you balance between COVID fear and opening up to push the economy? And we can add to that the report today in the news that Dharavi in Mumbai, the world's largest slum, apparently has had some degree of success in combating COVID locally through appropriate public health means. So in light of all of that information, how do you balance?
Well, that's the operative word, right? Balance. Because there are some jobs, for example, a whole variety of jobs in agriculture can be done without, too much proximity. There are jobs which cannot be done without proximity. And so and these kinds of decisions are best made locally, right? What kinds of, businesses are there in town, and you figure out how to limit the rise. And basically, what the center does is do more sort of broader, here are the broader sort of rules and regulations. If you hit more than dozen and such number of cases per 100,000, we start looking at you more closely. But till then, figure out what works best for you. And if you want equipment, etc., we find ways to allocate that equipment if it is done centrally or at the state level. But broadly, you need a mix of local as well as national sort of effort so that you can take into account precisely what this gentleman has said, that conditions differ from industry to industry, from place to place. You need that decentralized response. At the same time, there is a role for central responses on maintaining overall standards and overall allocation. So we need to figure that out, what the right mix is. I think what it has been is sort of a huge amount of centralization early, then a huge amount of decentralization with no stop in between.
Thank you. Bina, yeah, unmute, please.
No, I don't need to add very much to that. I think
that's great. Then I'll just we'll bring it to a close shortly. I will ask you one small question, which is, do you see this time as a time for potential possibilities for transformation? I think that both of you have had some comment on that. In the closing remarks, we just had Dr. Yunus in, I guess last week before, and he said, COVID has come, it's shown us what the truth is about our economy and our systems. It's time never to go back. What do you think? We'll start with Bina, and then Raghu, you can finish it off.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a time, I go back to the point Ajay made, that it's time to pause and move in a different direction. I think as economists, we need to also look at the conversations that are taking place beyond the discipline. So we do talk about governance. We keep saying governance is absolutely key. We talk about decentralization and cooperation is very important. But do we shift in a serious way in that direction? So let's just take the issue of cooperation. As you know, as economists, for a very long period of time, people just said, well, people can't cooperate. People, if you come together, you're going to free ride. You had more articles on prisoner dilemma games than on anything else. So this idea that we are atomized individuals, that the driving force of human behavior is self-interest, we pushed it as economists. I'm not taking responsibility for it, but yes, I'm part of the creed. And then it changed. What changed was the recognition that people are cooperating. People are coming together. Take Elinor Ostrom's work. I mean, it was inductive theory making by saying, look, you guys are saying cooperation doesn't work, but here are hundreds of examples where it does work. Well, let's change our theory. Let's rethink. So that next time we then advise on policy, we advise differently. So I think I would like us to talk also about how the discipline tends to shape policy and how we are just unwilling to reset our assumptions. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, for instance, I talked and what I'm working on for the past many years, which is integrated cooperation among farmers. Now, each time I mention it, people say, well, we tried it in the 60s. We failed. We tried it. Socialist countries tried it. I said they did, but this is a very different approach and model to what you tried historically, because we didn't understand how collective action works. Today, we have other models. So Muhammad Yunus provided that. For instance, when he provided the principles on which microcredit should be based: small groups, homogeneous, individual loans, group responsibility, all those principles. Now, those principles, I thought more than the microcredit, it was important that the nature of the institution, which was focused on, and that's what we carry with self-help groups and so on. So for me, credit is the least of the self-help group idea. The most important part of the idea is that we have small groups. You go back to Olson's theory of collective action, and you say, yes, he did talk about small groups, even though he was a skeptic. But the principles that Yunus gave, and those principles, I think, let's take them beyond the idea of microcredit. And use self-help groups. Today we have something like 6 million self-help groups, I think, and men can also cooperate. Why are all these groups only all women's groups? Is it something that the way we are pushing them? So my larger thought would be the importance of questioning our own assumptions within the discipline as well as in policy making. And we talk about thinking outside the box. Well, let's think outside those assumptions about both what motivates human behavior, but also what we would like as human beings. What is our idea of well-being? And this is
I'll
also
agree
your
with that.
domain, your domain, James.
It is
And
indeed.
I mean, the Sen always says, well, freedom, development is the freedom to choose what you have reason to value. One can only add, we should also have the freedom, the ability to choose what we have reason to value. And so that's where the inequality and other things come in. So let me close with that.
Thank you, Bina. And now to finish off, Raghu.
Well, that's a very heavy responsibility after Bina's very eloquent talk just now. Look, I really think India, I mean, the world, of course, is going to rethink a lot based on the pandemic, but India definitely needs to. Not because the system was working before. The system had stopped working even before. And I would argue that we had seriously thought about our direction and reforms maybe in the early part of the century, the last NDA government. And after that, unfortunately, we've had essentially policy drift. Now, I do think there is a lot of scope for new thinking. We need to think of what directions we want to go in, and we do need to think about how the political and the social side fit in with the economic side. What we have today is a government which is very, very determined on the political and social direction, but is very amorphous and very fuzzy on what the economic direction is. And what we need is alternatives to this kind of thinking. And we need to start debating those alternatives. I think India, the post-independence India was about a pluralistic India, which unfortunately was excessively centralized economically as well as in decision making. But over time, it has become much more decentralized. The question is, do we want to push that forward or reverse it? And these are all questions we have to debate. I'm hopeful the pandemic will be the tipping point, which causes us to debate these things. I mean, for sure, it will hopefully raise awareness amongst people that things haven't been going in the right direction, not just because of the pandemic, but even before. And can we rethink the idea of India, given all this, and given, it is nearly 75 years since independence, are we going in the direction that we want to, or do we need new directions? So to my mind, I think if the silver lining in all this is if it helps us rethink fundamental issues and see if there are new solutions. I mean, if nothing else, technology has changed, but we've also got a better understanding of incentives, of structures, of institutions. And that, as Bina says, I mean, the killer of all new thinking in India is we tried it in 1948 or 1973, didn't work then. No, I mean, there's a lot of reason to believe that that if you do it differently, somewhat, it may actually succeed. And so we need new ideas. We need to think about how to do it better this time around. And, our youth desperately need it because the future we're promising them right now looks quite bleak.
Right. Well, on that pleasant note, I want to thank our guests, Bina Agarwal, Raghuram Rajan, for their thoughtful insights on envisioning and re-envisioning India. I want to thank our audience for their questions and attention. And now from George Washington University, good day and good evening.